yeah, let's get started, I reckon. Yeah, other people will join as it comes. So firstly, thank you so much for joining us here for Cornwall Seal Group Research Trust's first ever virtual conference, sharing our seas, seals and people. This has been a unique experience for us, and we're really glad that even with the current events and restrictions, we've been able to celebrate the 20th birthday of the charity by bringing you a series of inspiring video talks all about our globally rare grey seals and the conservation efforts happening not only in the Southwest, but all over the UK. So if you don't know me, I'm Katie. I'm the Research Ranger for CSGRT, and I will be hosting this extra special Q&A session with our director and founder, Sue Sayer, and our patron and BBC Springwatch presenter, Gillian Burke. Little bit of an introduction for both of them. Sue Sayer is an internationally renowned researcher and author. Over 20 years, she has spent thousands, I reckon that's probably tens of thousands now, yeah, of hours observing seals in the wild from land and at sea. Sue founded Cornwall Seal Group Research Trust in 2000 and continues as a full-time volunteer to passionately protect grey seals and their environment for future generations to enjoy. And Gillian Burke presents on the much-loved BBC Springwatch and has also recently presented the BBC's Blue Planet UK and has narrated several documentaries. She has also worked as many roles from researcher to producer-director on several Animal Planet and Discovery Channel series. But closer to home and outside of her television work, Gillian applies her biology and media experience to work closely with a number of charities based in Cornwall, where she now lives, including Cornwall Wildlife Trust, the Marine Strandings Network, and of course, as patron to CSGRT. So thanks so much, guys, for joining us. We'd love for you guys to get involved in this session. It's very much an interactive question and answer session. And to do that, if you could send any questions to me, the CSGRT host, in the chat section, then I'll be able to read them and ask Sue and Gillian anything that you guys ask. I will try my best to get through all of them if I suddenly get like loads come through, but we are slightly time limited as well. So while we're waiting for questions from you guys, I've got a few questions of myself just to sort of introduce everything. So I'm going to start with Sue really, and kind of go right back to the beginning. What was it that got you interested in seals? Was it out of the blue, or had it been something that you've been passionate about for quite a long time?
That's a very good question, and the answer is I don't really know. But I do remember going climbing with Chris one day down by Land's End and having a pair of binoculars with me, so obviously it was very serious climbing, and saw my first seals come out of the water. I had no idea that seals come out of the water, you see. I didn't know very much, and I was gobsmacked, and that was it really. I think I was fairly hooked. And then obviously I'd seen seals at my local site too, and I'd asked myself the question that, are there three here, or is this just one keeping moving around? And of course, it wasn't until Stephen Westcott said the famous phrase to me that changed my life forever in just a few words, which is, every seal's got a unique fur pattern. And that was it, really. I was off on one. And then when I started to try and find stuff out about seals, I realised there wasn't much out there. There were a few historical papers for Cornwall. There were a few pretty old books. And I realised that seals needed to be represented. And maybe that I was the person to do that. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Get off your backside and do something, I guess. And I've recently learned that they have no control over their environment. I don't know how it's taken me nearly 20 years to realise that, but the fact that they don't have any control over their environment, I find absolutely fascinating and scary. I'll leave you there.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously you started to think about giving seals a voice and who that was going to be, and you decided it was going to be you, which is, you know, definitely something that not all people would be like, okay, I'm going to do that. So just a little bit about what you decided to do about that. You know, how did Cornwall Seal Group come about?
Well, I was just out on the cliffs, and generally I was quite antisocial to start with, and I wouldn't really speak to anyone because inside I am in my private life I am quite insular, really. I'm not really very extrovert, so I didn't really talk to people. And then all of a sudden I realised there were a few people I'd seen a few times, Kate Hockley being one of them. She was lying on the cliff top overlooking the seals, and she'd been there for quite a while, and I thought, you know, most people come and go quite quickly, but Kate was there for some time. And then I kind of braved it, I suppose, with a few people and talked to them on the cliff top. And then it didn't really go any further. And Stephen was trying to persuade me that it would be a good idea to set up a group, and I thought, no, I'm not sure I really want to do that. And then all of a sudden, I realised somebody got some really, I was very selfish. I realised somebody it was Caroline, had got some really good footage of seals. And I thought, gosh, I want to see that. And it was kind of pre-internet. Was there ever a time pre-internet? So in order to see this footage, I had to get around to my house. So I used the ulterior motive of, why don't I get a few people who I've now met on the cliff top, Terry Hocking being one of them, who is sadly no longer with us, a few people together, and let's just look at seal photos and videos. And that was it, really. I don't know why, I guess because I had quite a business head on. I think we'll sort out some aims and objectives. But the top aim and objective for the group was always to have fun. And it's still really in our constitution about having fun, because if people don't have fun looking at seals, they won't keep looking at seals. So yeah, that's how it started, really. It happened quite organically. It kind of grew from there. And the more, actually, Dave Jarvis was amazing at getting people involved with the group. He kept inviting people that he met, and they would just turn up at meetings. And at first, I guess I didn't actively encourage it that much, but Dave was great at it, and he realised what we needed to do, and he did it for us, and he hooked us up with shed loads of people, and yeah, the rest is history, really. So thanks to several people for making that happen.
That's great. It's really interesting, actually. I don't really think I've actually heard that story quite like that before, so it's really interesting for me, definitely, and I'm sure it will be for a lot of other people. So I think what we'll do is we'll come back to CSGRT in a minute. Just a reminder to people to send your questions to me through the chat.
Please.
Yeah. And I think we'll move on to Gillian, and I'm sure we'll get on to talking to seals at some point during this session, but definitely people know you well from your presenting on BBC Springwatch. So I'm sure people would find it interesting to know, you know, how that came about. How did you come on to Springwatch, and what it's like to be part of that team?
Sorry, I'm so naughty. Like immediately, like it's terrible, it's awful, they're horrible. No, there's this side in me that like wants to kind of be really naughty. No, that's not true at all. So how did I get onto Springwatch? To be honest, it's like, you know, like a lot of things, it's a long story. I wasn't one of these people that had this kind of like laser sharp focus, you know, like when I was 3 years old, I knew that this is what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't really have that. I've sort of meandered my way through what I would describe as sort of just life-changing experiences. I didn't know it at the time, but I look back now and I realized that I had a series of experiences that I sort of hit a certain point in my life and was able to look back and thread them together and all of a sudden make sense of things. But just to kind of, without trying to make this a really long story about me, my background is I was born in Kenya, and I spent the first 10 years of my life growing up there. I lived in Nairobi, sort of on the outskirts of Nairobi, so it wasn't exactly kind of out in the wilds in the bush, but it was sort of, you know, I still had a pretty like free and feral, I call it, it wasn't quite, but you know, my parents did actually know where I was. I never realized they did. But yeah, I had a lot of freedom to explore the world at my pace, at, you know, what I called like a child's pace. And, you know, I realize now when I sort of put myself back in that mindset, you know, I felt like I literally had access to the whole world. I realize now it was probably only just about like a half an acre of sort of, you know, ex-coffee plantation, but it really felt like just I needed nothing else. And I had a lot of time to scratch around the dirt. I was always fascinated with insects, the little things, probably because they were easier to find when you're that closer to the ground. And, you know, so that was the beginning. And I think one of the things that I sort of look back now and I realized was really important was, yes, I loved it. There's some beautiful things, beautiful flowers, certainly beautiful birds. I didn't know the names of any of them because I didn't have access to field guides. But, you know, sunbirds, like jewel-like sunbirds, you know, just incredible stuff. But my real experiences were the uncomfortable things, like pulling out thorns from my shins. I was always getting thorns. All the plants are covered in thorns in Kenya. And, you know, being bitten by ants. So that was, you know, so I think what happened is I grew up in an environment where I accepted that being outdoors meant some really fun and nice things, but also some uncomfortable things. And I didn't really judge it for that. It was just kind of part and parcel of it. So that was one piece of the puzzle. And then the other piece of the puzzle was that my grandmothers both come from Seychelles, which is, so I was very lucky. That's where I went for my sort of holidays when I was a kid. And so that was my sort of access to the marine world. And so as soon as we got there, I would literally spend like my waking hours in the water, and not doing anything in particular, just splashing around like kids do, you know. But it was just that introduction to an environment that I then became comfortable in. So those are like two really formative experiences. And then I sort of meandered off. My family left Kenya. We went to Austria because of my mum's work. I totally disconnected from nature, just because of where I lived. I just didn't recognize it. And then long story short, I did a biology degree. So there was obviously something in me that still kind of had a sense of, you know, oh, this is something I like doing. This is something I'm interested in. And then I came to Bristol to do my biology degree. And Bristol is also home to the BBC Natural History Unit. So I would walk past the NHU building almost daily on my way to and from lectures. Never occurred to me to, you know, that might be something I could do. It literally was just a place. And I would sort of look and go, oh, that's that place where, you know, David Attenborough makes his films. And I'd walk past there. And then a few years later, I'd sort of, you know, it's a really long story. I'm trying to like edit it down. I was like temping, doing sort of random jobs. And that was sort of the first time that occurred to me that I could actually, you know, maybe use my degree to, you know, to work in TV, because it seemed like an impossible thing to get into. I knew it was competitive, and I knew that like everyone I went to uni with wanted to do that. So it felt like, oh, I'm not even bother trying. But I'm glad I did, because it's, you know, been an amazing, you know, so a big part of that time I've spent working in TV and natural history TV was behind the camera. So I didn't really begin with an ambition to be a presenter. I began with an ambition to tell environmental stories, which, if I'm honest, particularly back then, so this is sort of late 90s, early noughties, there was not really the appetite for that in commissioning. So we weren't really being able, you know, I felt we weren't able to tell the stories about, you know, environment, about conservation. It was more, you know, the theory was that if we just get people to engage and, you know, find wonder in nature, then they'll care for it and preserve it. I don't know. I'm not sure that's worked, but anyway. So yeah, so that's what I did. And then I moved down to Cornwall. This is when I already had 2 children. I actually decided at that point I was not going to work in TV anymore. I couldn't see how I could be, you know, the mom that I wanted to be, and also have that type of job, which was very demanding and a lot of travel. So I was a stay-at-home mom for a really long time, but that was the best thing that happened to me, because it kind of slowed me down again, back to that child's pace, you know, walking the coast path with, you know, some toddlers. You're not going fast, right? So, but it made me stop, and it made me start kind of taking in what was around me. And actually, if I'm honest, the very first time that I actually started to pay attention to British wildlife, and particularly sort of being down here, the thing that really struck me was that there was actually like megafauna in Britain. That was not something, I kind of knew that sort of in some, you know, distant part of my brain, but to actually really take that on board. So grey seals, you know, the basking sharks and dolphins, you know, I didn't really appreciate that that was all here on our doorstep. So for me, moving down Cornwall, becoming a mum, was actually the most important part of my journey in terms of becoming a Springwatch presenter. Because from there, I started like approaching the watchers with stories about, you know, what I was seeing here. And I thought, well, I've got the network, the contacts. And the first story I took to them, which I could not believe they said yes to, was about hermit crabs, you know, and I was like, the return of the St. Piran's crab, as people may know it now. And I honestly, like, I thought they'd made a mistake when they said yes to it, because I had to kind of get back to them. I said, you do realize they're really small, like smaller than my thumbnail small. And they're like, yeah, that's fine, we're sending a crew. I was like, okay, great. So that was sort of the beginning of it. I didn't really think that would happen, but it did. And then the next thing you know, here I am. So yeah, that was the shortest attempt at that to answer that question.
No, I think it's a really interesting thing to see, because I think a lot of people in marine conservation have that same meander towards it, and it's sort of like those little realizations that do make them go, oh my goodness. Like, it was the same for me, you know, when I moved down to Cornwall. I was like, oh my, there's seals here, there's dolphins here. And I think that Cornwall, especially, you know, in our community, is a big part of why people are interested in marine conservation and the marine environment. So I think, yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that as well.
I just realized I didn't answer the bit about what's it like joining a team. They're lovely.
Excellent. I do actually have some questions from people here in the chat. So I will start with from Laura to Sue. CSGRT has grown and grown. Could you see it growing to a UK-wide collaborative photo ID database? And I guess sort of part of that is also, just in case people don't know what photo ID is, possibly going into that as well.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Great to get a question. So I do see it being part of a bigger thing, for sure. I don't think that we want to become a bigger organisation. I think we just want to partner with more organisations, and we've started doing that. So we have partners within something we've set up called the Seal Network UK and the Seal Alliance. We have partners in Scotland, in the northeast, on the east coast, and in northwest Wales, and in southwest Wales, and in Ireland, and in France. So we do see ourselves as part of a bigger thing. It's the only way we're really going to be able to help seals, because when I started, I thought it was going to be Cornwall, hence Cornwall Seal Group. But of course, we have to go where our seals go, and they go to all those places. As far as the database is concerned, doing the joined up stuff is, as you can probably imagine, a mammoth undertaking. So I think the key thing for me when I've partnered with those organisations is supporting them. So people probably don't know, but I've been supporting organisations around the UK for quite a lot, well, maybe 10 years. And Sal Bennett, in her talk about St Mary's Wildlife Conservation Society, mentioned that you know, these people who've got a passion just need that, yeah, I think it's really interesting, support, and then they go off and they just do their own thing and they make it amazing, which is exactly what Sal has done. You know, the network of rangers that they have on the East Coast is really inspirational in the field, and that's the sort of thing that we can take from them. So I do see it becoming part of a bigger undertaking even than now, and I do want to get, ideally it would be wonderful to have local communities right the way around the UK, like we have right the way around the southwest coast, local communities surveying seals on their local patch, being ambassadors for them, looking after them, looking for threats to them, representing them. I'd love to have that all the way around the UK. Not for us, but with a big team of partners would be awesome. I hope that's answered your question, Laura.
Yeah, I definitely think that answers the question for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what the video talks on our YouTube channel are about is about collaboration and how that's been, you know, massively formative in Cornwall Seal Group Research Trust's history and present and future. Let's have a little look. We've got one for Gillian from Emily, and she says, what is some of your favourite wildlife locally and also globally?
Okay, thanks Emily for that. yeah, I really struggle with these, like, what's my favorite, because I have, originally I just was like, there must be something wrong with me that I can't answer this question in a straightforward way. And I've decided, just because it's really hard to live with yourself, if you think there's something wrong with you, I've decided there isn't. So the reason why I find it hard to answer the question is that I've realized that I'm maybe one of these people that enjoys an experience and connection over and above having like a bucket list of things I want to see. And I think it's because, like, for me, it's maybe, you know, like the reason why I talk so much about my childhood experiences of being out in nature is that there's something just so, it's like beyond pleasing. It's just like, you know, like home is a really important word for me. So there's a sense of feeling at home. And I think what I'm always looking for when I'm whether it's, you know, exploring wildlife here in Cornwall or other parts of Britain or anywhere else in the world, is I'm probably looking for that feeling again that I had as a child. And I've started thinking a lot about this word home recently, because when we were doing the last Springwatch just finished, Chris Packham opened the series on the first night with a beautiful little pre-recorded film that he did in the New Forest, and he talked about how the sights, the sounds, the smells, everything made him feel at home. And I remember watching that back, because when we're on air, like I'll have a monitor so I can see what the others are doing and what's going on and all that sort of stuff. So I was watching Chris on the monitor while I was waiting to do my bit. And I was thinking to myself, that's really interesting, this idea of feeling at home in nature. And it started making me think, and I'm going off, you know, I'm going off on one now when I'm really supposed to be concentrating on what my next item is going to be. But I started thinking about the word home, because if we think about it, ecology comes from that same root word. Oikos is the root word for ecology, which means home, I think loosely translated. And so, you know, for me, I think that's what I'm looking for. So rather than thinking about a particular species, I genuinely can be just as excited about coming across an earthworm as coming across an elephant. I know that sounds hard to believe, but it's true. Like, you know, if I think it's just being able to find that wonder in everything. And again, for me, it is also the bit where my mind just goes, you know, is when I start to realize how intricately connected everything is, and how those connections, you know, the more complex they are, the more numerous they are, the more like home something feels. So I think that's when we start to really respond as living things, and we start to kind of go, oh, we are in an environment that is really alive, you know. So I think even people who haven't spent a lot of time in nature will recognize that feeling. So I think, to answer your question, Emily, I think that is probably my favorite thing, is when I know I'm in an environment that is not alive, you know, that all those connections are working well. And you just hear it, you know, you can hear it in the bird song, in the crickets, in the insects, in the leaves, you know, everything is working. And you just feel it. So that's kind of, yeah, that's what I love.
Can I just chip in after that? There are two elements of that really ring true for me. It's the joined upness of a multi-sensory experience, so the smells particularly as well. But for me, obviously, my favourite seal site is where I feel most at home. It is my heaven on earth, as it is for some other people on the call. And it's understanding a place really deeply for me, seeing it in all weathers, in all seasons, at all times, how it's changed over time, but having a really deep understanding of an environment. And it's the joined upness that's really key for me.
Great, thank you both. So this is quite exciting. I've got a question from Kim Aikman, who says, I am here on the west coast of the US. And monitor a colony of harbour seals that in 2014 numbered more than 700, and now today there are less than 400. Climate change, disturbances are a couple of reasons we believe here are contributing to the drop in population. Are you seeing the same drop in population happening there? So obviously Kim's talking about harbour seals in this one, but Sue, do you have any thoughts?
The answer is complicated, and it's a yes and a no. So it depends where you are in the UK about whether we're seeing crashes. But certainly in the north of Scotland, there have been up to 40 to 60%, I think even in some places, 80% drops in common seal populations. But that hasn't been mirrored everywhere. And there are some areas where they are still increasing, probably rather than increasing, recolonising sites that had previously been lost for all the reasons that you so well outlined. And I think that because of big drivers like climate change that affect everything, that seal ranges are changing, whether they be, well, all species ranges are changing, aren't they, irrespective of species. And I think there's some readjustment going on, but I think then there are also the risks and threats and human impacts that they're facing that are probably potentially leading to an overall decline.
Great, thank you, Sue. So we've got a question here from Lou Hatwell, and actually it's about disturbance. So I think both Sue and Gillian know a bit about this, so I'm open to whoever wants to answer or chip in. But she says, we have a lot of issues with boat disturbance, and this is especially a problem during the pupping seasons, as we get a few premature pups each year. Luckily, this lockdown has done amazing for our common seals, and so far no premature births have been recorded. But I'm wondering if there's any way we can go about to protect the seals from this type of disturbance in the future.
Okay, well, I could start off and just say I think there's no way we can answer that effectively on this call. So probably the best thing to do is to email us, please, because Katie probably knows more about disturbance than the rest of us put together, and we could give you loads of hints and tips about how to act on that. But it looked like Gillian had something to say, so I'm going to defer to Gillian if she wants to chip in.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not, I don't have any sort of real specifics. I was actually gesturing because I was like, I think Sue would
Okay.
take that. But I actually do want to add something very briefly to it. You know, I think there's like a bigger question here. And, you know, I think when I sort of, you know, through lots of lovely conversations with Sue, which came about through my work on Springwatch, we sort of, you know, got to know each other better. That was when Sue had asked me if I would be interested in being a patron for the Cornwall Seal Group Research Trust. And, you know, one of the reasons I said yes to it, even though you know, like I said earlier, I try not to have a favorite animal or favorite species of anything, because I kind of think we need to see the system as a whole. One of the things I can say about, you know, animals like grey seals is that they are, you know, these great sort of ambassadors. I use this term a lot when I talk about seals. They're marine mammals, but they're still tied to the land, and they bring information back in terms of the state of the ocean. And because they're animals that are relatable, they sort of look familiar to us, and certainly to even people who maybe don't have very specific interest in wildlife. They're kind of very captivating to watch. So they help us in, you know, being able to tell stories of the state of, you know, the marine environment. However, I think, you know, watching grey seals and other marine mammals also raises, you know, for in the instance of disturbance, also raises to me a really, really difficult question to answer. And I think this is sort of something that all of us who love going out into nature, love watching nature, kind of need to do a little bit of soul searching about, because while, you know, I mean, I'm probably, you know, the worst person to be saying this, because a lot of my work encourages people to go out and watch wildlife, yet I also have this kind of feeling as well, which is that sometimes we do also need to kind of step back and give it space. And I think grey seals, you know, is a perfect example of a species that needs a bit more space than we are used to giving them. And even people who love them or want or think their interaction with them is actually a positive one, you know, getting that message out that, you know, if a seal's looking at you, you're already too close, you know, getting that message out and really doing some soul searching as well in terms of like, how can we love nature but still give it space it needs, is a really, I think it's a big question. I'm not planning to answer it in its entirety over here. It's more just a sort of a little bit of food for thought off the back of that question about disturbance.
Yeah, I think we do need to do some soul searching for sure. But just to finish off with the answer is that we have done systematic research into disturbance. We've got a project ongoing with that, and we'd love to hook up to try and give you some experience from that. But I think if we had to cut it into 1 or 2 sentences, what we've discovered from it, it's that it is a really big problem and it is quantifiable, but that also the causes of the disturbance are very, very site specific. And therefore any action or solution has to be very locally focused and preferably community stakeholder driven.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as both Gillian and Sue have said, disturbance is one of the most complex issues that we have at the moment. And yeah, if you just want to get in touch with us, we have some reports online on our website that talk about disturbance and possible solutions that we're working on. And also we've got a video up on YouTube, if you haven't seen it already, that talks a little bit more about disturbances as well. But thank you for the question. Let's have a little look. Who have we got here? So so Jodie has a question for Sue. Well, I guess actually both, because Gillian is also part of this charity. A bit of an open question, but where do you see the charity in, say, 10 years from now?
That's a very good question. I see us, well, do you know what? My main thing on my bucket list at the minute is to provide some financial security for the charity, because at the minute we don't have that. And therefore that will affect our future existence in terms of rangers. However, I see us pretty much working as we work now, but maybe with more partners, as I said earlier, and maybe on a more global scale potentially, as in, trying to roll out this fantastic model of citizen science that we've got with a fantastic network of people. I don't expect that we will grow very much, because I think as a charity, I don't know if Kate would agree with this, but I think as a charity, a key thing for us has always been that small is beautiful, because small is reactable and can be proactive and not held back by having large committees of things to go through. So yeah, that's where I would see, but it'd be interesting to see if Gillian's got any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, my involvement with the charity is, kind of, I would say very peripheral. I love what the charity do, and I think, as Sue said, it's small but really effective in terms of just the man or woman hours, I should say, that go into this, into the work. It's phenomenal, and the network of volunteers and the rangers as well is just really incredible. And so I love, I find it a real honor to be part of the charity, even in a peripheral way. I guess with all conservation work, my sort of la la land kind of dream would be that actually would like all of this work would be redundant in 10 years. I think it's safe to say, I hate to say that that's unlikely. So in terms of in 10 years time, we are beginning a decade. The UN has declared this the decade of habitat and ecosystem restoration. And I think, the challenge of joining single species work and campaigning with the habitat and landscape restoration, landscape scale restoration is really important, because I mean, what we all know is that you can't the species can't survive if the habitat doesn't exist for it. So that's what I would hope over the next 10 years. I think Sue's absolutely right. Growing the charity any bigger is not necessary. Scaling it up is not necessarily the way forward. But I think she's already said as well, it's the sharing of information. And I'd say that's beyond other charities that work with seals and marine mammals. I think, habitat is a really important thing. And again, grey seals, because they have this ability to be like an indicator species of what's going on in marine environments, the data that CSGRT is producing is, could prove really, really vital in completing the picture. I mean, we've seen it in sort of terrestrial habitats. One of the examples that people use a lot is Yellowstone National Park in the States. And I can see Kim there nodding. You're up really early, by the way. I'm just saying, if you're on the West Coast. Yeah, but that's a beautiful example of how a top predator was introduced into a system, and the cascade effect, its presence has had the species, the presence of wolves in Yellowstone National Park has had an amazing effect on like the whole ecosystem. So, again, that it's not a sort of like for like comparison by any stretch of the imagination, but the idea that the work that this charity is doing, partnering up with work on habitat restoration, could be really, really powerful. And I know there's a lot of work at the moment with restoring seagrass meadows and other marine environments. So like rewilding the seabed, basically. And that can only benefit if there's more join up between all these different efforts and around British coastlines and elsewhere as well.
I do have some la-las. My la-las would be to have a marine wildlife centre for Cornwall or the southwest in Cornwall, because as you've alluded, we've got some great megafauna and we'd really love to have a marine wildlife centre, and we'd like to be based in it. That would be cool. Maybe an office, not in my spare room, would also be cool. But the other la-la is an attitudinal thing. And the attitudinal thing is that people really got the ecozoic thing, which is we are an organism ourselves within an ecosystem upon which we depend, and therefore we are not just rulers over this ecosystem to do stuff with, but we're part of it and we shouldn't have any control over it. And that would be my la-la, that people finally begin to appreciate we are just part of an ecosystem upon which we depend.
Yep.
Long way to go with that one.
Another clap on Zoom, but
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, how to follow that. Well, we'll go to another question, and let's have a look. This one is from Dr. Rob. Hi Sue, many conservation academics like me are uneasy about naming the animals we study, putting human labels on wild nature, anthropomorphizing species. But is it good for garnering public support, and how do we balance that dilemma?
Wow, good question, Rob. Not surprised, but good question. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with naming an individual. Why is there anything wrong with naming a human? Why can we not recognise that animals are individuals and therefore deserve an identity? For me, every seal counts, and I think that's as important in science as it is in public engagement. And the other aspect about anthropomorphizing, you only have to watch grey seals closely for a short period of time to understand that there is some very complex stuff going on in their behaviour, and we can't understand their behaviour by being inside their heads, because we're not seals. Although I would quite like to be yes, that's another one. We can't get inside their heads. We only have our experience of the world to go by, and they are a high-level marine mammal, and therefore I think there are some crossovers. Yes, we might get it wrong sometimes, and yes, it is absolutely critical for getting people to engage with these animals. If you want people to understand the environment, you need to talk about things that mean stuff to us, which is home, which is food, which is sleep, which is rest, all that kind of stuff. But you watch seals' body language and you understand that this is a very complex society and we have to understand it in the best way we can. And therefore, if you call it anthropomorphizing, I call it understanding behaviour. That would be my response, really. So I think we've got a lot to learn from field experiences to bring it back to kind of pure science, really.
Yeah, actually, interestingly, in the chat, Jocelyn has said Jane Goodall at GOOM named the chimpanzees, and that helped researchers, local people and the wider public a lot. So that's just another example of how individual stories can help conservation. Gillian, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I did actually. And I don't know who, I didn't catch who raised the, it's pronounced Gombe. Raised that Jane Goodall named the chimps. Now, this is an interesting one because Sue and I don't always, we always agree, but I'm not sure I'm 100% in line with what Sue said. Now, I think with regard to the work that Cornwall Seal Group, CSGRT does with grey seals, I think the naming is derived from the photo ID work. And certainly the work that they do at the Seal Sanctuary as well here in Cornwall. It's a shorthand. It's a really quick way of then being able to recall the name of the seal, the story of the seal, without like having to go through a series of numbers. So I think actually the value of naming the seals is more than just public engagement. I think it's actually being able to recall easy for the people in the field who they're looking at and being able to identify quickly. And I'm seeing, a lot of the rangers nodding their heads there, so thank goodness for that. So in that respect, I'm all for it. However, I really struggle with this, and again on the watches, I think we name things all the time. And I remember there was a lovely, I think she was about 11 or maybe a bit younger, the daughter of a friend of mine, and she has a lovely way about her. She's almost slightly tuned into a different frequency. And she didn't look particularly sort of happy or impressed, basically, by me, which is great. I love kids for that. And it looked like something was sort of on her mind. So, we got chatting, I was reading a story and stuff. And then, she just said, actually, I've got a question. And she said, why do you have to name everything? She goes, why can't you just let wild animals be wild? And when kids ask you something like that, oh my goodness, it just cuts through all the crap, So I had to really think about it, and I sort of, rolled out lots of answers about public engagement. And I do think it helps. And I think right now, whatever works, let's use it, But I think again, this doesn't really apply at all actually to here in the SEAL group. But I think a bigger picture kind of answer to that question is in terms of making it more inclusive. I do think that naming animals can sometimes make it difficult for other people to access. And the reason why I say that is like growing up in Kenya, and particularly with the elephants and some of the lion prides, they've all been named, mostly now. They weren't when I was a child. So I find that strange that people know the prides by names and know individual elephants by names. I still find that a bit odd. But the names are often David or Richard. And it does make me wonder whether, it all of a sudden takes the ownership, like who's responsible for these animals, who's looking after them, whose animals are they, all of that stuff, but also doesn't make it very inclusive because they're sort of European names on animals that don't exist in Europe. Now, it's just a thought, it's a perspective, but it does make me wonder about, like, even in this country, like, whether we should be using more Welsh or Celtic names or Gaelic names. It's a kind of a prompt of like, how do we make the natural world and wildlife more inclusive? Because I think right now we need, as many people on board as possible, to move things in a direction that I assume, if you're here, you would like to see in terms of, our natural world being taken better care of. Let's leave it at that.
The ownership thing, I think, is something that I have thought about, by naming something, it kind of potentially transfers some potential ownership, but I struggle with that one. But the inclusivity one is a concept I'd not thought of before, and you're so right on that. I need to think about that more.
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion, and I actually reckon we probably could do a whole session on it, actually. But just to back Gillian up about the photo ID thing, is that we've had a message from Kate Williams, who is in fact our photo ID coordinator, and she says, yes, the names are to help with ID. And I know that all of the rangers say that. And also a lot of the same seals will have different names to different photo ID coordinators, depending on what patterns they can actually see. It's a very subjective thing. Let's have a quick look. This is a really interesting question from Sarah Fox. She says, I am watching this with an interested 13-year-old. Like Gillian, we home educate and have found that this allows us to slow down and discover nature so much more. The CSGRT team has Septimus, but how else can we engage and encourage this love of nature within the younger populations? both with regard to seals and more generally? I don't know who wants to go for that one, but...
Well, I'm thinking that Gillian's probably much better qualified to answer that question, not having any children myself. However, we'd love to be in touch with you, Sarah, and try and work on some resources. That would, you know, some more, because we've already got free resources on our shop site that are available to download. But yeah, it's something that I think we'd like to get more on. I had something else to say about that, Sarah, and I'm sorry it's gone, so I'll pass over to Gillian.
Hi, Sarah. I'm not sure I can see. I'm trying to get a view, but maybe not. So yeah. Oh, there you are. Hi. One of the boxes waving back. Hi, Sarah. Yeah. So when so this period of time when I allude to, my children are now 13 and 11, so we're in a different zone now. But when they were smaller, the decision to homeschool was actually kind of born out of necessity rather than, you know, a kind of active, you know, choice in terms of, you know, a feeling or not opinion about mainstream education. So I was very lucky when my son was in reception year. He had a whole year in reception in our local primary school. And I think by the end of that year, it was clear that it wasn't an environment that, you know, he was getting very, very stressed out in it. So initially, I took the decision that I would just homeschool him myself. I then very quickly discovered I'm a terrible teacher. So, and I'm not even saying that to be funny, I really am. And then luckily for all of us, just down the road, so really close to the Cornwall Seal, the Cornwall Seal Sanctuary in Greek, there is a little ecological school called Zelda School. And it's on a farm. It's got a little, like a couple of fields in the corner of a farm where there's like an orchard and stuff. And they have 2 yurts, so it's very hippie. So there's 2 yurts, and those are the classrooms. And a lot of the time the kids spend outdoors, and they go up to the end of Key Stage 1 until kids are 8 years old. But they do sort of, you know, they do the curriculum stuff, but it's called an ecological school because the children more or less have access to, you know, and do a lot of their learning outdoors, and particularly sort of the preschoolers as well. I mean, they, you know, they just spend most of their time outdoors in all weathers, and it's amazing how resilient both the children and the teachers are in being able to do that, you know, through winter as well. So for me, I mean, how you do this in cities, I don't know, but I'm convinced that, you know, the first really important step in terms of children engaging is having access to any kind of outdoors. And, you know, when I sort of go up country, if I'm in Birmingham or London and stuff, and I just look around and think, well, that's clearly not available. And that I personally think really needs to change. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. I think where access to outdoor space already exists in schools, that needs to be thought of differently. And you know, the kind of risk avoidance approach to, you know, designing these outdoor spaces for children, I think needs reappraising. I'm not the teacher, so I don't know how to, you know, I don't appreciate the complexities of having 30 or plus children in a space outside and what you need to consider. But so that's why I use this word reappraise, you know, just look at it again. But certainly in cities, you know, for me, one of the things that I feel like I really want to start championing in my work is greening up urban spaces. We really need to look at, and I don't know how applicable this is, I don't know where all of you live, but, you know, the kind of inner city sort of urban environments that so many children grow up in. I just think we need to just say that is no longer acceptable. You know, we need to look at those spaces. We need to be redirecting funding into being able to green up those spaces, because that is where, you know, in terms of the vast majority of people, that's where people live now. And that's where we need to be kind of giving children those experiences right from the get-go. So not necessarily worrying too much about how much they actually learn in those environments. It's just having the access to it in the first place. A little bit like, you know, I say, I had the time to just mooch around. That's, I think, just give kids the time to mooch around in the outdoors. And my just one last point to that, because I can feel I'm on a roll now, so I won't go on too long. But one last really important observation that my son, who's now 13, made. So in the town where we live, he's at the moment, you know, he's observed that his friends, he says they're calmer and easier to get on with when they are on the beach as opposed to when they go into town. He didn't say whether it was worse or better or whatever. He just made that observation. And I thought, that's really interesting. That your environment will change your behavior, your stress levels, and how you respond. So, in terms of like communities that don't have access currently to outdoor spaces, we need to look at that as, the benefits will be, on many levels. It's not just about, sort of environmental, it's going to have all kinds of benefits. There's a lot of research to support that, but I think I'll stop there.
So I would add, as an ex-teacher, that there has been a lot of progress made in Cornwall, but it's easy, as you said, it's easier in Cornwall with things like Kernow Woodland Learning, with forest schools, with beach schools, with 60 Days Wild, all sorts of things. But there are farms in London, that do educational stuff. And I think if we had more community green spaces that actually offered activities for schools and for children, that would make a hell of a difference as well. So I think there's potentially scope for greening up as much as we possibly can, but also providing green resources that can offer the kind of activities that will really engage children too. But mooching around in nature, there's nothing better.
Oh, and just one other thought, which to me is a new concept, but it's urban marine spaces as well. There's some really interesting work going on in New York, of all places, where there's a group of marine biologists really trying to promote that as a space. And in Plymouth, we've got that opportunity as well, with the Plymouth Marine National Park. So that could be done here too. So it's not just about the sort of, urban green spaces. It's also, where, particularly being an island, this country has a lot of potential for urban marine and those sort of environments to be made more accessible.
Yeah, very good point. Can't believe I didn't think about marine. And I should just give a plug as well, because OCR and Exam Board for Secondary are doing a GCSE Natural History consultation at the moment. And we've literally just had our feedback back from what we submitted, because we asked to have a summary of what we'd actually put in. So if any of you want a copy of that, it's very easy to send out to you. We spent a lot of time thinking about it as a steering group. Having a formal qualification in natural history will really help, and I really think they're going off on a tangent with it and missing the point a bit. Kate's nodding, I can see. We thought they were missing the point a bit. So if you have any interest in submitting anything to that consultation, I think it runs for another month. We can send you what we sent, only as a starter, so that you can either agree with it or disagree with it, but at least you engage with the process. Having a formal qualification, I think, is part of the, primaries have really started to get it. Secondaries haven't at all.
Great, thank you. Just to follow up from Sarah, she wants to say, please let Sue know that I have met her in Porthscatho at her talks, as has her son. And they are watching now because they were inspired by those, and is very interested in the work of CSGRT. So I think that's very special and shows that, that we are doing some really good sort of educational stuff that's inspiring future generations.
Thank you.
So we are coming up to the end of the hour. I just want to ask Gillian and Sue whether you're okay to answer sort of one more question. Do you have time? Yeah, brilliant. I won't be able to look at, I won't be able to cover all the questions, but if you do have any more questions for Gillian and Sue, then if you email me, Katie, Katie, at cornwallsealgroup.co.uk, then I'll make sure that I get them to Sue and Gillian, and we'll try and answer them as much as we can. But I'm going to end on a question from Tina Robinson. She says, as you know, I am a big rubbish person. And I have noticed an incredible amount of rubbish, plastic and textiles on Polzeath Beach here in Cornwall. The worst I have seen in 12 years. Has anyone else noticed this? And do we anticipate an increase in entanglement? I thought we might see the opposite, so feel quite devastated by this.
I'll happily start, but I think Gillian will have a lot to say about this as well. So yes, I am a fogger, and a fogger is a person who walks around their local community picking up rubbish. And I haven't been doing it during COVID because I've been worried about touching stuff, and I feel rubbish about it. And I do wonder if there's an element of that going on, because there are a lot of foggers, And I do wonder if people have stopped doing it a bit. Now there's a little bit less concern, you know, there are ways around it, just wear gloves and wash your hands when you get in, all that kind of stuff. But I do think that there's been an increase in disturbance post-lockdown. It's like at some of the places reported it's been extremely bad post-lockdown. It's like we've forgotten what we'd learned before lockdown, which is weird because we've appreciated our environment during lockdown, so I don't get that. And yeah, litter on our local patch is much worse, and on some of the beaches, because the beaches are usually cleaned by people and they haven't had access to clean them. So the new, you know, the stuff that's always been there is continuing to wash in and not going anywhere.
Gillian, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, well, I could go on. I'm going to try and make it make sense, though. The first thing I'd say is I would agree with something that Sue has just said, which is it's confusing that the behavior post-lockdown seems to not be consistent with all the kind of commentary that we were getting during lockdown about how amazing nature was and how, oh wow, we've all stopped and now we're appreciating it. And you know, I'm going to try not to be political, but I can't help but say that, you know, the recovery plan that was unveiled on Monday kind of seems to be following that trend, that, you know, we have, like, I think for so many people, there's been this sense that nature's kind of been there for us during lockdown. And I hate to say it, but, you know, there's a really like sinking feeling in me right now. And I'm definitely going to put all my energy into, you know, doing whatever it takes actually to counter this. But it does feel like, yeah, I don't want to be too negative, but it just feels like we haven't maybe kind of come out of this the way many people were hoping we would. That's probably the best way to put it. So with regard to, you know, sort of seeing more plastic and other types of litter on beaches and just generally, so I don't know how many people on this call right now are sort of locally in Cornwall and Devon, but one of the things that my observations that, you know, we could possibly make a difference with is the way that rubbish is dealt with and handled when, you know, during the collection. So this is a really practical thing. I noticed that on rubbish day, you know, I live in a town that is right on the sea, and the days the bins are put out, you know, we all know the herring gulls are going to have a go because that's what they do. I tell you what, the herring gulls make me laugh so much. I spend a lot of my time trying to convince people that they need to be protected, that their numbers are in sharp decline, they're red listed species, and then they act like such. You know? I was going to use a swear word, I won't. They are so antisocial. You know, and I just like go, oh my gosh, you've just undone all my work. Anyway, the herring gulls have a go, and they, you know, literally right now as I speak, after this call, I'm going to knock on my neighbor's door because the gulls have been in their bin. So, you know, so that's, to me, the problem with that is it doesn't take a big leap of the imagination to think, well, it's raining today, and that litter is going to get swept down into all the storm drains and out to sea. Now, you know, for communities that are coastal, like the people who live here, that should be something that we get. And also, if I'm honest, it's something that the council should really take that responsibility. The way rubbish is dealt with here is not, oh God, I'm going on a soapbox, aren't I? Is not acceptable. So, and I do think, you know, there are some very simple fixes, which I won't go into now. There are some simple fixes that could make that situation better. So for me, there is, you know, that's something that we could action, you know, anyone who lives in the Southwest Cornwall, Devon, because the logistics of the bin rounds is very unique to where we live. But that's something we could definitely deal with. Anyway.
I might be able to shed a tiny bit of light on that apparent paradox of our behaviour and appreciation of the environment during lockdown and post, is that during times of recession, we once listened to a Dutch professor talking about paradigms of living at a conference in America. And he said that during times of recession, basically what happens is the environment goes out of the window. Everything goes back to where it was before. And I think that it may be that because of the economic situation, we've just forgotten again about the environment, even though we appreciated it a few weeks ago. Now we've, you know, coming back to reality, environment goes out the window.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, because I was recording a podcast with someone locally, Simon Gill, Dr. Simon Gill. He's actually an engineer, works in the aviation industry, but he works in risk assessment. And he studies human behavior in situations so he can build more resilient systems. So he was an interesting person to speak to, because his current role as a consultant is looking at healthcare trusts, how to build them more resilient, so how they can take what they've learned from the COVID pandemic and take that forward to build more resilient systems. But there are lots of parallels that can be kind of rolled out outside of, you know, those industries and sectors. And one of the things he said that, you know, they've observed is that in times of rapid change, system change, which is what we've seen during COVID, the barriers come down and people tend to share information more willingly and freely and more quickly. But as soon as that situation reverses or stops, the barriers actually come up and they go up even higher. And he said, if you can bring awareness to that, you can stop this massive pendulum swing. So I think, you know, what we are all doing today, for example, is probably something none of us would have done, I don't know, I'm guessing pre-lockdown. So it's bringing that awareness that actually lockdown created a situation where we felt togetherness and felt community, like globally. And we need to make a concerted effort to continue that and to kind of keep feeling that connection, even when it's people on the other side of the planet or in other communities that we don't know, just to keep working with that.
Great, thanks guys. I mean, we could go on forever on these topics. But unfortunately we've run out of time. Just really quickly, I just got a request from Gillian. I think Jocelyn is asking for which podcast you're referring to so that she can go and find it.
Yeah, it's not out yet. It's called If I Rule the World. And I'm still recording episodes for it. It's not actually for me to rule the world. I'm going to be interviewing people from all sectors, not just the environmental sector, but I'm going to be interviewing people, or I am interviewing people, looking at system change and, you know, asking people, well, if you rule the world, what is the one thing you would do differently? So, because quite often actually the solutions already exist. So we don't need to actually be kind of, you know, reinventing the wheel. It's just making sure we're talking to the right people. So it's a bit tongue in cheek, If I Rule the World, but that's what it's going to be called. And I will be doing a lot of noise on social media when I release that. But yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Sue and Gillian. I mean, we've covered so many topics. There's so many more we could, but you know, maybe in the future we'll be doing this a little bit more so that lots of people can get involved in discussions about, you know, the wider marine environment and of course seals. So thank you. Really, really grateful for all that you both do for the charity and beyond. So
very much.
Also, of course, thank you to everyone for joining us. It's just been so nice to see familiar faces, faces that from across the world. I mean, really amazing stuff. Hopefully we'll see some of you in the next live session and possibly even the networking session later on today. But don't forget, if you haven't already watched our online talks, they're up there on YouTube. Just search Cornwall Seal Group. There's 18 talks on a range of different sealy topics, and you know, they're definitely, if you're interested in seals and community, citizen science, that kind of stuff, then you'll definitely be interested in them. And also, if you would like to support us or get hold of some awesome sealy merchandise, then head to our online shop, sealresearchtrust.com, where you can also find out about our Wild Seal Supporters Scheme. And also one more thing, is that we have a crowdfunder launching this Monday, 6th of July, time to be confirmed, but probably at some point in the morning, which will help us continue our important work. So please do check that out. There are some really awesome rewards that you can get your hands on, exclusive rewards as well. And yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope you've enjoyed the Sharing Our Seas conference.
Thank you, Katie, for organising it and making it all possible. Thank you, Han.
Yeah, and thank you for hosting so beautifully. And I just wanted to show, this is one of the t-shirts that you can get. It's ethically made and organic, and it's lovely to wear. So yeah, check it out. I think they're great. I love them.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's fantastic. We really appreciate it. Bye-bye.